But before I get there, I want to talk a little bit more about some examples of the mistaken thinking of the West that we need to get away from. Some clear principles that underlie and always have underlain successful business. And I want to talk about purpose, values, license to operate, stewardship. These are the things which lie at the heart of successful business. Before I go on, I just want to mention that I'm delighted that in the audience today is Tomorrow's Company's Honorary Ambassador in Singapore, Christine Sim. Christine, who's sitting over there, and who has worked, thank you, and who has worked with us over the last few years in growing the influence of Tomorrow's Company. And it's a great privilege still to be working with Christine in building the awareness of the principles that we believe underlie the success of Tomorrow's Company. So, mistakes of the West. Can anybody tell me which company stated these values? Well, I'll tell you. It was Enron. And, of course, the ability of so many companies to have wonderful statements of values and not, as the Honourable John Yap said, not to walk their talk. This has, of course, created great cynicism about business. But could the Enron disaster have been prevented? I've argued in a paper I wrote after the Enron crash that they could have been, if indeed the board had made values much more central to their concerns. Because I talk about something called the behavioural audit trail. When you see people not practicing what you preach, that's when the directors of a business really need to ask questions and to probe more closely. And any non-executive director of Enron who had looked closely at the gap between the stated values of Enron and what was actually going on could not have failed to notice that there were serious causes for concern. Let's take a British example in terms of the mistakes from the West. Some of you may have heard of a company no longer existing under this name called Railtrack. In the UK, we privatised our nationalised rail business in the early 90s under a Prime Minister you may have heard of called Mrs. Thatcher. Actually, I'm wrong, it was just after Mrs. Thatcher's time. It was her successor, John Major, when it finally went through. Railtrack said, OK, we are now a listed company. We are going to look after our shareholders. In the late 1990s, things had started to go badly wrong. And this photograph is a photograph of one of the 3 major and fatal rail crashes that they experienced at Southall, just outside Paddington Station in London. 3 tragic examples of things going badly wrong in a business which had lost sight of the primacy of health and safety. First job I ever did in business was as a health and safety officer. And what did they learn? The chief executive of the time had learned something, because he said this. Can you all see it? That we've moved completely off the profit agenda and the shareholder agenda. After privatization, we stayed on that for too long. Well, how did the investment community react to that? This, in the Observer newspaper, was how one city analyst described their reaction to what the chief executive was saying. His primary concern is to look after the interests of his shareholders. If he really believes that, it was time he was put out to grass. Well, that's how you talk about a deadbeat horse, isn't it? And it is this either-or thinking, this idea that you can only serve shareholders by, as it were, saying at every moment, whatever shareholders want, we must give them. As if that works with children. All of us as parents know that it doesn't work with children. Why should it work with shareholders? Those are 2 examples of the kind of perverse thinking that, in my view, has damaged the approach to business in the West. I'm sure you could think of many, many more. So, let's think about the things that haven't changed. The enduring principles of successful business which tomorrow's company has sought to represent through the mouths and through the experience of business leaders. Our organization is paid for entirely, and its projects are entirely populated by chief executives, by senior people in businesses. It is an organization which is, if you like, an enlightened voice of business. And this is a summary of what it's about. If we can generalize about successful business, what can we say? We can say that all businesses have customers, that all businesses have employees, have suppliers, have a community in which they operate, and have shareholders. That if we want a successful business, the task of leaders is to align, to unify those different interests around a strong common purpose and common values that everybody can believe in, that everybody can commit to, and everybody can feel that they can trust. And the business, furthermore, has what we called in 1994, a word that has become very widely used around the world, a license to operate. And it's like a space, business in the middle, all of those constraints around it, and if it behaves with integrity, it can expand its freedom of maneuver. If it fails to behave with integrity, you see that space actually contracting. You see trust being lost, and ultimately you see government intervening. And we talk about the idea of a virtuous circle of governance. Governance starts with having clear leadership and purpose. Then you get the definition of, well, who are our key stakeholders? Then you get to you need to define, where does our success come from? What is our success model? What are the things we ultimately need to be focusing on and measuring if we're to be successful? And all of these things are unique. No one business is the same as another. And the work of the board and the work of the management of a business is to understand how they're unique. Then we get on to measurement. And we've got the session tomorrow with Jeffrey Williams where we're talking about the measurement of social impact. A very good example. That's where that fits in the whole virtuous circle. But you don't start there. You can only measure when you've worked out what your success model is and when you've worked out what your purpose is. Then we get to the point of communication. Many people in CSR think that CSR is about a CSR report. Well, it's not. It's about a report in a context of the total virtuous circle. And its purpose is to create a dialogue. A report, a CSR report, is only as good as the questions it stimulates, as the learning from stakeholders that comes from those questions and challenges, which then in turn comes back to influence the leadership. And we're back round the top of the circle, and so it goes on. And that is a very simple way of thinking about the place of CSR within the totality of governance. So, we believe that those are enduring principles of every successful business and the context in which one should think about corporate social responsibility and sustainability. Let me talk a little bit now about the things that are changing. And most of this is very familiar to you. All of these things are shaping our world. And in a place like here on Aklan, it's so visible. And I must say, it's very impressive just visiting to be very aware of the way in which the authorities here are making the public aware of how the world is changing, of some of the key pressures that we believe are now upon us, the pressures of water, the pressures of increasing demand for food, the pressures of the demands of an increasing population of energy and the impact on climate. I don't need to labour those points. You're working with them all the time. But something else has changed. And that is, if you think about the world of 50 years ago, it was a world in which, yes, there was international trade and international business. But on the whole, you could say, with Milton Friedman, remember Milton Friedman, the economist, who said, you know, the only social responsibility of business is to make a profit because the government will look after all the externalities. Well, in a global context, where's the global government that looks after all the externalities? There isn't one. The global standards that are emerging for business are having to be created brick by countries and companies and, very importantly, NGOs, civil society groups, working together. When I heard the mayor say earlier, we couldn't do it on our own. Exactly. That's the point. In a global context, it's the way in which business and governments, national governments, and to the extent that we have them, supranational organisations, weak as they are, work together with civil society to create the rules that mean that companies work within a framework where they're not involved in a race to the bottom, to the lowest wages, for example. So, those are the things that have changed. The changing context, the crisis of finite resources, particularly against growing population, the crisis of climate. You know about those things. What does this mean for our businesses? Well, in 2004, 8 years ago now, Tomorrow's Company managed to bring together this group of people. Nandan Nilekani, who is now an Indian cabinet minister, was then chairman of Infosys, one of the then leading figures in BP, and these other companies which you will see listed here. And we asked them, on a global scale, the question that was the founding question of Tomorrow's Company on a UK scale. What is the role of the global company in a changing world? And here is what they said. And notice this. This is 5 years before Michael Porter and Shared Value. This is 6 years before Dominic Barton of McKinsey. They said after 2 years' reflection, an intense argument, they were determined to come up with a common statement of what is the purpose of a global company. And this is what they came up with. And it didn't say, our purpose is to create shareholder value and everything else follows. They said, our purpose is to create something that's useful. Useful to customers, useful to human beings, and everything else follows from that. And if we do that, then we will be meeting a human need, and that means that we will create value for shareholders, who incidentally also ultimately are human.